let's go ahead and get started then with our forms module. It's a long chapter. I think it's almost 50 pages long. So once we work for about an hour, we'll see where we're at, and I suspect we'll go ahead and take a break, even though we don't have another module to do. This one's about as long as the 2 modules that we did yesterday, so we'll probably need a break about halfway through or so. Okay, so chapter 5, if I remember right, I need to put the module number in these PowerPoints, don't I, is on forms. So an introduction to forms, but we'll continue to look at forms pretty much for the duration of the class for different things, different items that we might be talking about. But this is where we really get into the form and relation and record and entity properties that we're briefly talking about for the last 2 days. So a lot more of that today. And hopefully by the end of today you'll have a lot better understanding of how those properties work. Okay. So our learning objectives for Chapter 5, we're going to identify common form types in mobile apps. We have 4 different kinds you can see here. We'll take a look at each one of them. The first 2 are the most common types of forms, list and grid forms. So we'll spend the most time on those. But we'll also address the API device type forms and web component forms, which we'll find are really not forms at all. But that's the best way, or the best way we can think of to refer to them, because they do display content. So we refer to them as forms, even though they're not really forms. And then we'll talk about form elements. If you're already familiar with Genero and you've worked with Genero products or worked with BDL before, this might be a review for you. If you're brand new to Genero, or if it's been a while, then you might benefit from a review of all the different form elements. We'll learn to model and implement a grid form. And remember, grid forms or CRUD forms are used for CRUD type operations. Create, update, add, and delete type functionality. So we're going to learn to model and implement a grid form, a CRUD form that uses a grid for adding, updating, searching, and deleting data. And then we'll go through the same process for a list form. So a list form is created slightly differently from a grid form, and the idea of a list form is just to display, just like it sounds, a list of values. So they're not as complex to configure, they don't need as much decoration as a typical grid form. We'll learn to manage form behavior by setting properties on form objects, records, entities, and relations to affect the form behavior. So this is the day when we'll do the most with properties, but we'll also address properties some more tomorrow. And then we'll work in Form Designer to enhance forms. We'll talk about all the different form elements early on, and then we'll kind of walk through the process of enhancing a form. When you work with forms, there's a shortcut. You don't actually have to run the application to see what your form is going to look like after you make your changes. Instead, you can use a preview option. So we'll be looking at that preview option just for a shortcut whenever you're working and trying to get your form designed just the way you want it. And then finally, I think about the last topic in the module is this managing form records. We have just a few slides there on records, which we've talked about before as being basically making up the screen record. So if you're familiar with Genero, you might be familiar with the screen record. It's the data set that you're working with in the form. All the fields are represented in the form record. So we have a pretty big list of topics here to get through. So characteristics of a good mobile form. I'm sure you've worked with mobile devices and seen a lot of mobile forms, so you're familiar with most of these characteristics already. You know that they're small, they have to fit on a mobile device, so you can't put a tremendous amount of information in a single form, so you have to try to just make sure you show the most important information in a form. And if you need additional detail, then you offer the user some sort of an option like tap access to get to more information by opening up a different form. So they're small. We try to show only the most important information. If the user wants it, we allow him options to move into a different part of the app or open a new form to see more details. They have to be manageable. If we have too much information on the screen, it gets overwhelming and the application gets hard to follow and hard to understand. Purposeful. Every form has a specific purpose, or it should have a specific purpose. So that form is there to display certain items of information, and you don't want to put any additional extra information on the screen that might be distracting. Instead, your forms, again, should lead to detail. So the user should have an option in a form. If there's more information that he can access or might be interested in accessing, there should be tap access or a button that he can press or tap to lead him to a different form or a different part of the app so that he can see additional detail. And it should be ergonomically friendly. So no matter how the user holds the physical device, whether it's portrait or landscape, the form should behave properly, and it should look and feel like a native app, like the user's familiar with, that uses an Android phone, for example, or an iPad. So keep forms simple. So that's the acronym we're using, SIMPLE. This next topic, we're going to look at all these different types of forms. We've got list forms, grid forms, web component forms, and device API forms. And again, the last two aren't really forms, but we categorize them as forms, just to make it easy to talk about them. So there's a list form, a good example of a list form. So you can see that a list form is just designed to show a list of information. It's limited to 2 columns of information, and you can see that the way it's arranged in the list form is with what you would consider the most important information first, and then any detail information that's important enough to put in the list is displayed second and has kind of a more minor display than the major information in the form. And notice also that you have an optional image that you can display in a list form. They don't have to have images, but that is an option. Later on, we'll actually see how to create a form that displays an image, the optional image. And also, since we are limited to 2 columns of information there, what we might call the major and minor pieces of information, we'll also talk about being able to concatenate information. For example, let's say it's customer information. I maybe want to show the customer full name, not just one column from the table and the second column taking up all the space. I can concatenate my fields together and display them in one column, and that way I get more information in a single column. So we'll see how to do that later in our custom code module. Just for now, though, just be aware that list forms are limited to 2 columns of information. So here they're showing customer name information. I guess it's actually business name information. Sorry, business name information with it looks like maybe a customer code associated with it there, and then some information about the job, maybe the job code. But you can tell that that major piece of information, the part at the top in the first column, has been concatenated. So they've used the method that I just talked about to concatenate 2 or 3 fields together and then display them to this one column in the form. So we'll learn all about that as we go along. Notice here too that the user has tap access to another form. So if he taps on a row in the list in this example, that's going to, it looks like, cause another form to open up. So that's a common way to use list forms. Here's an example of a grid form, and you can see that a grid form is more complex. There's more information that you're able to display in a grid form, but again, remember the simple acronym that we looked at earlier. You don't want to get too carried away and try to show the user everything in a single form. So you try to limit even grid forms to the most important information, and then you offer them access to different forms. Like here you can see with these disclosure indicators that the user has access to another form. If he taps or selects a line and taps on a line, it's going to open up another form which will give him additional information about lines, photos, notes, or timesheet in this example. So again, that's a good example of just showing most important information in a form, but allowing the user to access different areas of the form, or different forms that have additional information about the job or the customer or whatever it happens to be. Here's a web component form. This is actually right from the Pool Doctors application. This is a web component that you can tell performs signature capture functionality. So once a job is marked as complete, or the technician marks the job as complete, that actually executes the code that triggers this web component. The web component is embedded into a form, so that's why we say it is a type of form. And then the form displays and we get the web component functionality, which in this case is a signature capture. So we can actually see that. You can try it out on your Pool Doctors app if you want to when you do your labs this afternoon. And we'll take a look at those more in the Advanced Topics chapter that we do on next Friday. And then finally, the last type of form is the Device API type of form. And similar to web components, I wouldn't really call this a form per se, but it does display content, so this is a good way to categorize it so that it's easy to reference and talk about it. So this is a Device API example of course, being able to phone, so the phone device API, being able to call someone. So there's our four different types of forms. And as we go through the rest of the modules, we'll talk about how to implement all four of those different types of forms, all of the properties that apply to those different types of forms, decoration for the forms that can be applied. We'll do them in different modules. For example, in this chapter, we're going to address the two most common types of forms, the grid forms and the list forms. And then later, gradually, we'll get to the other two, the web component type forms and the device API forms. So we won't do them all at once in this chapter, but we'll get to them. So here's the review of the form elements. So list and grid forms, which is what we're focusing on in this module, can include one or more of these form elements. The first one is containers, and we'll take a look at a lot of these different containers when we explore our actual Pool Doctors app here in a while. But we've got grid containers, we have folder containers, table, group containers, all kinds of different containers that you can use to create the layout that you're looking for, the look and feel that you're looking for in your list and grid forms. You always have to have at least one container, so they're mandatory. Almost every form, I would think, has form fields. At least list and grid forms typically always have form fields, which are areas where users can view and edit data. So form fields are probably the most common type of form element. Right? Now containers are mandatory, so you always have those, but you typically have a lot more form fields than you do containers in a form. And then the fields the form fields are defined with a certain type of widget a lot of times to be more user-friendly for the user. So for example, it might be easier for a user to fill in a state when he's filling out customer information if he's able to pick that state from a combo box or even perhaps a Zoom form. And so a widget might be a combo box to allow the user to pick from a list. It could be a radio group, it can be a checkbox. We have a lot of different kinds of widgets, and we'll talk about a lot of those this week. Probably not hit every single one of them, but we'll talk about a lot of them. The Edit widget is the most common type of widget. That's your default type of widget, just a normal form field that the user can enter data into manually. Action views. Tomorrow we're going to continue to talk about forms and properties, and the topic that we're going to focus on for part of that chapter is action views. So action views are views in the form items that the user can use to trigger some sort of action. For example, an action view might be a button or a top menu item, toolbar icons. Those are all examples of action views. So they're there to allow the user to trigger some sort of an action so that he can access another part of the application. A lot of times he's triggering an action that will open a new form. And then finally, labels are text areas that just display descriptive information. There's two types of labels, but we'll get into the details on these as we go through the module. Typically, people use static labels, right? They're just hard-coded text. So here's more information about containers. Containers are blocks, areas on the form that hold other containers, right? You can nest containers if you need to, and they define a formatted screen region. So we have simple grid containers, which is probably the most common type of container. Well, it is the most common type of container. And what you see here looks like a grid, and it just allows you to lay out form fields in a way that makes it easier for users to read. So containers can be nested to create a visual layout. We have special containers like group containers that you can use. That's actually one of the things we see here in this screenshot. Looks like this might be one group here, and we've got another group here. So a group is just an area on the screen where you've got some grouped form fields. And again, it's just to make the form more attractive to the user and easier to read. So some valid containers, and we'll take a look at these all here in a few minutes. I'll kind of demonstrate some of them, maybe not all of them, but most of them. VBox and HBox are short for vertical and horizontal. Get rid of this for a second. There we go. Group containers, you can see those on the screen there. Group containers are used to group form fields that are, I guess, related. They would certainly be related before you would want to group them. But it allows the users to be able to tell which form fields are grouped and just organize them in a more attractive way. We have table containers, which we talked about a moment ago. List forms use table containers so that you can display a list of information. And then we also have folder and page containers so that the user can look at folder tabs. Almost everyone's familiar with folder tabs. And then when you trigger a folder, then you see the page of information for that folder. So here's some action views, or a screenshot that shows some action views. We've got some toolbar items. We've got some top menu items. We've got some buttons on the form. There's some buttons down here. We've got a button edit, it looks like, down here at the bottom. It's hard to see, but it looks like a button edit down here at the bottom. Typically, button edits are used to bring up a Zoom form or to trigger a Zoom form, and we'll learn how to do all that a bit later on when we talk about Zoom forms. So button edits play a big role with Zoom forms. So more on action views tomorrow in Module 6. Data fields, lots of data fields in this form. The whole idea there is just showing information from a database typically. Form fields don't have to be from a database. Sometimes they're form only. And we'll see some examples the next 2 weeks of why you would use some form only data fields. And then finally, I think the last element that we talked about earlier were labels. Labels, you can see, are just to show descriptive information for the user to describe the form fields that he's looking at, like first name, last name, phone, and so on. And labels can be static or they can be dynamic. By dynamic, I mean they can actually come from a database, for example. So dynamic labels are less common, of course, than static labels. Typically, people use static labels for the most part. But be aware they can come from the database, and they are configured differently, slightly differently. Here's a list of all the widgets and form items that we have available. Some of these are used commonly in mobile forms, some of them not so commonly in mobile forms. I'll just kind of give you a heads up on some of the ones we'll be looking at for the next week or so here. We'll take a look at phantom widgets. That's a type of widget. A phantom widget, we'll see those quite a bit this week, is used so that you can include a form field in your record but not display it in the actual form. That's really handy for making sure you have all of your primary key fields in your record for being able to select unique rows from the database and that type of thing, but you don't always want to show the contents or the values of your primary fields in your form. So a phantom widget is what we would use to hide a form field that we don't want to be displayed in the actual form. So we use those quite a bit. So here's fields. We're familiar with those. Form items or fields. Edit widgets, button widgets that we can use to trigger an action that probably opens another form. That's what we typically use them for with mobile forms. Button edits are commonly used to trigger an action that opens a Zoom form, so we'll visit those a little bit later on. Combo boxes, we've already mentioned, allow the user to pick from a list of items instead of having to remember it themselves and type it all in. So those are handy. We'll see some examples of combo boxes this week, or next week. We're getting close to the end of the week. It may be next week. Check boxes are maybe not as common, but you can use them with mobile forms. Date edit fields, we'll take a look at those. We've got some of those, I think, in the Pool Doctors app that we'll visit. We talked about group widgets. We have images so that you can display images. We'll visit that because we do have some images that we're going to display in some of our forms this week. Labels are all over the place, right? We've got lots of labels. Remember, those are just to give the user information about the form fields. And a lot of other widgets. We won't see all of these. We won't be using the progress bar this week. We won't be using a radio group this week, or a slider, or spin edits. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about those, but they're all in the documentation. So if you're curious about some of the other widgets or form items we support, you can look those up in the doc. We will cover tables. We'll have some text edit fields in our forms, so you'll see some text edits. Time edits, I believe we have some date time edit widgets that we're using, so you'll see some of those. And on Friday of next week, you'll see some web components. We have a web component widget that we can use to embed a web component into a form. So what this is showing you is something we talked about yesterday. If you're curious about a particular widget or form item type, remember that you can always just select it in the Properties view, and then if you hit F1, it'll go ahead and pop up the correct doc page to explain that widget to you. All right, so the next section here is on modeling and implementing a form for adding, update, searching, and deleting data. That's a long way of saying we're going to look at CRUD forms. Before we pop in there, let's go ahead and take just a moment to look at some of those containers. We don't have to look at them exhaustively because we'll be seeing a lot of them for the rest of the course, the next week and a half or so here. But we can go ahead and at least get a quick look at a few of them. So one of the forms that's used in the Pool Doctors app that has several of these different form items that we've just talked about is the job header grid form. So I thought that might be a nice one for us to take a quick look at here. And again, I won't spend a lot of time on it because we'll be seeing this over and over for the next week or so. So here we've got some containers in this form. Notice that this form has what's called a VBox container. Remember, that stands for vertical box. And you can tell just looking at the form that it's a vertical box because it adds this brownish area to the top and the bottom with the little pointers going each way, the little redirectional arrows going each way, letting you know that it's a vertical box versus a horizontal box, which would go the other way, right, from left to right. So this is a vertical box container, and that container has a grid nested inside of it. So this area here is a grid. Let me highlight the grid there, select the, whoops, I clicked once too much. Let me open that back up again. So there's your grid. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see these little rectangles along the side so that you can see the grid layout. And then inside the grid, you can tell they're nested here in the form structure view. You've got all the different form fields and the widgets that are defined for them. So here's an example of a label. So if you look over here on the right in the form structure view, you can see that that's a label. We've got a phantom widget that we're using here, and of course that doesn't show up in the form at all because that's the whole purpose of a phantom widget. Apparently we don't want to see this JH customer field in the form, but we need it in the record. So if we need it in the record for some reason but we don't want it in the form, we use this phantom widget, which is what we're doing here. Here's the most common type of form field, or form field type, is the edit widget. And one thing you can do is you've got a convert widget option. If you right-click on a form item, you have your full list of widgets to pick from. So I won't change that one because it's fine as an edit widget. Here's a date time edit widget. So right here, this JH date created field is a date time edit widget, which makes it easier for the user just to pick a date. Instead of having to type in a date and a time, they can pick it. So it's set for him automatically then. Here's a button, a start button, and a complete button. We'll look at buttons a lot this week and next week, but just to look at some of the properties for a button, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Get back in there. There we go. Buttons have a name. And that name we'll see is very important as we go a little bit further because that's the name that we're going to associate with the action that's going to trigger opening a new form in a lot of our mobile applications. So buttons are important because they allow us, the user, to select an action or an option to go to a different part of the app or open an additional form. So the name of the button is important because that's the part that's tied to the action in the code that causes something to happen, some sort of event to happen, like a new form to be opened, for example. But down here, it's the text that actually determines what the user sees on the form. So the text property, which in this case is complete, is what the user sees. But the part that's important for the application in the code is actually the name of the button. So that's the part to remember when you're actually working to configure some sort of action event. And again, we'll talk a lot more about this as we go along. Let's just see if there's any other widgets out here in this particular form that look interesting. I think that's about it. So we have buttons, we have phantom fields, we have edit fields, we had a date time edit widget, so we had several different types of our widgets to take a look at there. And two different containers. We had our VBox container, and then nested within the VBox container we've got our grid container. So that makes it a reasonable introduction, I think, to looking at the different types of form elements. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this next topic, modeling and implementing a form for CRUD operations. We're going to say that for short instead of reading all that. So creating a grid form. So here we're looking at a screenshot from the Office Store Mobile demo project. Whenever you install Genero Mobile, it comes with a bunch of demonstration projects where you can look at some of these code samples and you can look at BAM samples, and it makes it easier sometimes for you to get started with your own project if you can see some examples first or some samples. So that's what this is. This is from the Office Store Mobile project, and specifically the Accounts for FBM, and that's our name that we use for our modeled forms. So here is what the form looks like in the Form Designer window, or the Form Designer view, and then over here are the properties. Grab my highlighter here. So here it is in Form Designer on the left. Here's the form structure view where we've got all of our form elements and where we can change the widget types or edit the form element. And then down here are the properties that we saw a few minutes ago. And then over here is the actual form displayed on a mobile device. So we're going to talk about how you create one of these grid forms. So there's several steps. We'll go through all the steps here. The first step is inside the BA diagram. You're going to right-click on your form entity. Remember, your form entities are sitting there with the green plus sign when you first create them, which tells you that it's not yet implemented. There's no code yet for that new entity or form, whatever it happens to be. So here there are, one second, let me check my chat window here. Got a message. Okay, let me stop right here for just a second. My coworker has sent me a chat message, and it sounds like maybe there's some problems with the control panel. So that he's thinking that maybe that's the reason I'm not seeing the raised hand icons or the chat interface. I'm not real sure how I can find out, but let me just turn on the, probably the easiest way would be for me to turn on your ability to speak. All right, so I'm going to unmute you for just a second. Okay, so everyone is unmuted. Is anyone having trouble with the chat interface? Anybody? Everybody's able to use it okay? So you haven't been trying to send me messages, but you can't?
Yeah, well, I know I had issues today, and I got a message from one of our staff about it.
Ooh.
But they're saying they can still see the slides in the interface. So just if anybody is having issues, do send me a message. I put my email address up in the chat window, which you wouldn't be able to see. So it would be sbarney, S-B-A-R-N-E-Y, sbarney@4jays.com, just so it's something that we can look at. And I believe it's if you're going through the web interface and not using the GoToTraining viewer.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'll know to watch for that next time.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, tomorrow I'll try to be sure that I ask you before I get too far along. Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Back to our program.
No worries. I'm glad you let me know. Okay, I'm going to mute everybody, and then we'll go back to this creating a grid form.
Muted.
Okay. Everybody should be muted again. So I can't remember exactly where I was, but anyway, you're going to right-click on your form entity that you've created in your BA diagram, and there's going to be an option, Implement CRUD Form from Database. And that's the option that you use, of course, if you're using database fields in your form. So it invokes a wizard, so there will be a wizard pop up, and you just walk through the wizard to continue to build the form. Now once you've built the form, you can use Form Designer, and you can use that form structure view, and you can use toolbar items in Form Designer to enhance the forms, and we'll look at that a bit later on. So in Form Designer, you can add additional containers like the VBox or the HBox. Typically with mobile devices, you're going to be using VBoxes, vertical boxes, not so much horizontal boxes. I would think, at least not for mobile devices. You can modify labels and widgets. You can add buttons for actions in Form Designer, and I'll give you a demo of that. I'm not the world's best myself with designing a form. I'm not very creative, but I can at least get you started with that. And then finally, I mentioned earlier that you can preview your form without having to rebuild and run the application, which can be time-consuming. If you're just trying to arrange a form a certain way, you don't want to spend a lot of time going and having to execute the application every time to see what that looks like. So you can do this as a preview, just like it says, to get an idea of what that form is going to look like when it is implemented and run. So a very handy option. So here we're talking about using the wizard to create a form. And here it's showing you the column selection dialog from the new form from Database Wizard. So for grid forms, you're going to use this implement CRUD form from Database. That invokes the wizard, and then we're just going to walk through the wizard to create the form. Now, there are a few things that we need to talk about with this column selection dialog from the form. Basically, you're thinking that you can just go in and select just the columns that you want to display on the form, but actually there's a few columns sometimes that you have to get even if you don't want to display them on the form. And specifically, we're talking about keys, primary keys. So anytime you're going through and creating a new CRUD or list form, make sure that you get your primary key values. If you don't, if you just pick various columns from the table and try to implement the form, you get an error that tells you that you have to have your unique key. So make sure you pick your primary key values. So keep that in mind. So you are after just the information you want to show on the form, but you do need to include your primary keys. Now when you include your primary keys, remember, if you don't want them to show up in the form, you can just set it to a phantom widget, right? You can just go in and change it. We'll see that again shortly. So grid forms use a grid container, right? Or CRUD forms use a grid container. So a grid container is by default the one selected in the wizard. So actually you could just take the defaults here. They have table highlighted as well because later we're going to talk about a list form, and list forms use table containers. So that's why you see both of those kind of enabled or highlighted there. It's just for demonstration purposes here in class. So we only use two types of containers for mobile forms, grids or tables. So here we're focusing just on the grid. Now here's another part of the wizard, the query creation dialog. And the happy news about the query creation dialog is that typically you don't have to do anything here. Notice that this one already has information that the wizard itself has managed to add for join criteria. And it's doing that based on the schema, the meta schema. If you have your primary keys and your foreign keys configured in your database, and then when you extract your meta schema, that information then is in your meta schema, then you don't have to worry too much about this query creation dialog in the wizard, because most of the time it will already pre-configure that part for you based on your keys, primary keys and foreign key relationships that you have configured. So that's the case here between, it looks like, account and country. You can, though, specify a where clause. Whoops, I missed it. It's up here. Where clause, if you have specific rows that you want to be selected from the database, not everything, but particular things, you can specify a where clause, and you can also specify an order by if you like. So those are optional. Otherwise, again, it will use keys to determine the order by. And then right there inside the wizard, you can set your labels and widgets in the last dialog of the wizard. Now most of the time, it's much better to go ahead and do this in the meta schema. We talked about yesterday in the database chapter that you could do all this setting of labels that you want to be default labels and all the forms that use a specific table column. You can specify a default widget that gets used whenever you specify a particular column. So if you'll do that at the meta schema level, then you don't have to do it every time you create a new form like this. So that's the recommended way to do it. But in some cases, certain forms you might want to use a different widget than you've selected for the default. So you can always change the widget type later on, right here in the wizard when you're creating a form, or in the form properties itself. Right? We saw earlier that you could change that in the form properties, form structure view. We've already talked about the phantom widgets. The idea with phantom widgets, they're pretty common with mobile forms because we don't have a lot of room on the form for a lot of extraneous information. Things like primary key fields that we don't really feel like the user needs to see. We can hide those and save some form real estate by using a phantom widget to keep that field out of the form, but it's still in the record so that our application code can use it for selecting rows of data and that type of thing. Now here's the Form tab and Record tab. Once you finish the wizard, and by the way, this is the last dialog of the wizard, the setting labels and widgets. When you finish that and you click the Finish button down here on the wizard, that form is going to be opened and displayed in Form Designer. So that's what we're seeing on this page. So we've got the form, it's showing in Form Designer. This one it looks like they picked every single column in the table, it looks like. And you have two tabs. You've got the Form tab, which is the default view when it first opens up, and then you've also got a Records tab that you can see over here on the right. And remember that this record represents all the form fields that have been selected for the form. You don't have to show them all in the form, but this is available to be used as your screen record in the application code. So this represents all the form fields from the database, for example, that are going to show in the form. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. One of the things I did this morning before we started, let me see if I can find it. Is this it? Here we go. Is that I went ahead and went back to that test project that we used yesterday just to show you the project structure and the directory structure and how to create new entities in your BA diagram. So I kept that, and so here it is again today. One of the things that I did this morning, though, is I went ahead and deleted the default database and the default schema, the My database and the My database schema that we talked about yesterday, and I went ahead and replaced it with the actual Pool Doctors database so that we could see some real tables and columns and experiment with some of those things instead of just an empty database. So one of the things I did, just to kind of go back for a second to our conversation yesterday, is I did have to edit my FGL profile. Now with SQLite and the Pool Doctors database, that's a very small database, relatively speaking. So what I did was actually just made a copy of it and just put it right here in this test project directory structure. And then all I had to do then to access it here is just change my FGL profile settings to the Pool Doctors database here, and then specify the name of the database file, the SQLite database file. So that was an easy change for me. Now if you're using for development purposes something else, a different type of database like an Informix database or Oracle database or something like that, you won't probably want to pick it up and move it like we can do this little SQLite database, but what you can do is edit your FGL profile and add connection information to it to be able to access that database wherever it's sitting. So again, there's good documentation on the FGL profile file and all the different configuration options it has in the documentation. So just for now, I'm just going to refer you to things that are kind of important as we go along through the course this week. So I thought you might think that was interesting. So Thought I popped it up there. So in any case, back to forms here. So yesterday we were looking at learning how to add entities. So we added a program entity and a form entity. So I'm just going to use this new form entity that we created yesterday to walk through that process of implementing a CRUD form from database. So I just right-clicked on my form entity and I'm going to pick this Implement CRUD Form from Database. That pops up the wizard. So here's my new form from database wizard that we just looked at. And I'm just going to pick some fields here. Let me open up this job header table. Before I go too far, right up here's the database. Notice the database is Pool Doctors, so you can double check that and make sure it's pointing to the right database. Here's all the tables that are in the Pool Doctors database. And then I'm going to pick some columns to display from this job header table. And notice it's telling me here that I have a foreign key in my job header table referencing the customer table. So there's some information in the customer table that I can access too from the job header table. I have a relationship there. So here from my job header table, there we go. I have to pick the right table again. Let me stretch this out just a bit more. There we go. For my job header table, remember we don't want to typically get too carried away with our forms. We just want to keep the most important information in there. Spread that out too. So I'm just going to pick something I think is important. So I'm going to pick the primary key. Notice right here it's got this key symbol next to the JH code. That's how you can tell what your primary key is without knowing a tremendous amount about the database. So I remember that I need to have my primary key or I'm going to get an error when I try to create or implement my form. So make sure you pick that particular column even if you're not planning to display it in the form. So I'm going to pick that and then I'm going to pick the other columns here that I actually want the user to see. So I think maybe the customer information, maybe the date created for this job might be interesting, and then maybe the status of the job. So I'm going to pick those particular columns, and then I know I have a relationship here with this customer table, and I do want to see more customer information here. So I'm going to pick some additional fields from the customer table. So let's see, maybe the name of the customer would be something more important than the customer code, which it looks like is what we have so far, and maybe their phone number. So that's probably plenty for a lot of forms. Now you can certainly put more information than that in a grid form if you want to, but if you get too many things in a form, you can imagine it gets overwhelming on a small mobile device. So I'm going to stick with those columns there. And here I'm going to click Next. And remember, for a grid form, a CRUD form is a grid form. I'm going to pick the grid container. And then here's my query creation. The reason really that I picked the customer table and picked some columns from the customer table was so that you could see this join. Notice that I don't have to go in here and hit the plus sign and specify the join criteria. And the reason I don't have to is because I have my primary and foreign keys defined on my database. My metaschema picked that up when I extracted it, so all of these relationships are already there and my wizard and BAM are aware of them. So that's one of the big benefits of doing that ahead of time. It saves a lot of work on this end. So there it's picking up the join condition automatically between the job header table and the customer table, the two tables that I picked columns from. Now I'm not going to specify a where clause or an order by clause just because I want to keep this reasonably short, but I could. And then finally here's my last dialog. And notice that I haven't gone out to the actual schema, the meta schema, and configured labels and widgets for any of these fields, right? They're all just using the name of the column as the label. That's the default. And the default widget is an edit widget. So these are all defaults. But here I could go in and, for example, date created, maybe I might want to use a date edit or a date time edit widget for that to allow the user to select a date instead of having to try to type one in correctly. that can be a pain if you've ever had to do that. You know, sometimes you have to get the format just right or else it fails. And then all the rest of these widgets, for right now, I'm just going to leave them at the default. So I'm going to click Finish, and there's my form. It said it would pop up there in Form Designer, so that's what it's done. It has a default name, Form1.4FDM. Up there at the top of Form Designer, you can see the name of it. And this is what my form looks like right now. Here it is over here in the form structure view. You can see I only have the form and one container. I don't have a V box or an H box at this point. Perhaps in a little bit later demo after we take a break, we might come back and look at this again, and I can show you how to add a V box and buttons and all of those good types of things here shortly. But there's what the form looks like. Right now we're in the Form tab. That's the default tab when the form first opens. So right down here is the Records tab. So there's the form record. That's what the screen record is based on, is this record here that you see in Form Designer. All of these items, all of these diagrams, the form has properties. All these properties here in the form. The record has a lot of properties. So here's some properties for the record. Functionality. We're going to talk about a lot of these properties in detail today and some of them tomorrow. Alright, so I should probably save my form. That'll be my last step here for this part. We'll come back to it maybe for adding things to the form and enhancing the form later, but I'm going to save it here. And I've gone in and created a virtual folder under my application node that I just called Job Header because I knew I was going to pick something from the Job Header table. So I'm going to save that form here. Up here at the top I can specify the path. I'm going to save it here to the source directory. And then I'm going to save it to that virtual folder under my application node. Alright, so now I've saved it. And notice now in my application or my BA diagram, the green plus sign has gone away from my form, and I could actually try to run the form now. So there's the application, and the application is running. So that was pretty quick and easy. It's a lot faster than going through and doing custom code to do all of that. It took me about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and that's with us stopping to talk a lot about it and what we were doing. But it can be very, very fast to develop a simple app or even a complex app compared to doing it all by hand. Okay, so I'm thinking that this is probably a good place for us to stop and take a break before we get into this properties part of the class. So it's a little earlier than what we usually stop, but only about 5 minutes or so. So we'll take a big 15-minute break today. So the next topic is managing form behavior with properties. So we've been talking about these properties some the last couple of days, so now we're going to look at them in more detail. So little guy's question is, how do I control what CRUD functionality is created for the form? You may not want every form to be able to do all the CRUD features. Add, modify, delete. So how do you control which options are actually supported for the form? Another question, how can I control which row is selected when a form is opened? So we'll address that question in this topic. And then finally, how do I limit how many rows the user sees? So again, we may not want every row to be displayed when a form is open. We might just be concerned with very specific rows in the database, maybe just the rows that have to do with a particular order or a particular customer, for example, in a detail table. So how do we do all of these things? Those are the topics for this section. So we've talked about properties and different places that you can set them. So here is an itemized list of places where we have properties that affect form behavior. In Form Designer, we have Form and Record tabs, and both of those have a set of properties. In the 4BA diagram, entities have properties and relations have properties. So we have properties in several different places, and all of those can be used to tweak and tune the behavior of your form. When it's opened, when the user selects accept or cancel, all of those things are controllable with these properties. So the first place we're going to look is in the record. So in the record for the form, you've got, I think of this as the default set of functionalities. So to me, this is the best place to set overall CRUD functionalities that you want that form to be able to perform. So if you want that form maybe in different parts of the app, but you want it to be able to create, read, update, and delete, search, this is where you can set the ability to do those functions, is in the record. Now, you can override these functionalities, we'll see in a minute, in another place, in the relation. So kind of put all that together as we go along here. This is the overall functionality for the form. And remember, though, that that form can be reused. And if you reuse it, you may want it to have different functionalities each time that it's reused. So here's where the relation in the BA diagram can disable functionality that's been set in the record. So you set overall functionality there, and then for each relation that you configure for the form, you can disable the parts that you're not wanting the form to perform in that specific relationship. So that's what we see here, functionality properties in the relation, and this is where you can go in and disable functionality that you don't want the form to have for this one relation. Now the form may just have one relation altogether, but it may also have 2, 3, or even more relations, and you can control the functionality for each relation independently with these specific properties. So those are very important properties to remember, right? If there's one thing from this topic, I think, to remember, it's these 2 pages, right?
Unmuted.
The thing is being able to set the overall functionality for the form here in the record, in the Form Designer diagram, and then being able to disable specific functionality for the form at the relation level for each relation. And that way the form has only the behaviors you want for that particular relation.
So Lisa, can I stop you for a moment?
Sure.
Right now, the only thing I'm seeing on my viewing screen is managing form behaviors with properties.
Thank you so much for stopping me.
So and that's, I hear, a same there from somebody else in the audience. There we go. Now it's moved on to CRUD functionality.
I hate to admit it, but that was an operator error.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you letting me know. Okay, so I apologize, you guys. I had your screen frozen while we were on the break, so now I've unfrozen it, so you should be able to see everything.
And
so
I don't know which one of these is us, so if you want to mute me again, that's great.
Okay, let me mute everybody. 1 second.
Muted.
There we go. Everybody should be muted now. Thank you, Sylvia. So I apologize. I completely forgot to unfreeze the screen. So let me make sure that you've seen both slides because they're very important. Okay, so here was the first one. The CRUD functionality that you can set on the record is the functionality overall for the form. This is a good place to think in those terms, is at the record level. Anything you might want this form to do, enable it here. And then for each individual relation that you configure for that form, this is where you can customize the functionality by disabling the functionality you don't want. Right? So I can disable just the add, but allow the user to modify or delete or search, and so on. So that's probably one of the most important things in the whole module today, are those two slides and understanding that part. Now another important part, but we'll address this again tomorrow, because tomorrow is the big day to talk about actions and action views. So this is just, think of this as an overview for tomorrow. CRUD functionality and actions. So every selected functionality generates the code underneath the covers to present actions for the form and action views that the user can see and select, trigger, to cause an event to happen, something to happen, like perhaps a new form to be opened that shows them additional information. So that's where these special actions, these menu options that you see come from, is from the selected functionality. And we'll talk a lot more about what these actions look like and how you can control what they look like and how they appear on tomorrow's Chapter 6 module. So back to more properties. Row position. This row position is a property on the relation. Notice you can always kind of tell what we're talking about if you lose track. Down here at the bottom of the screen, and I hope you can see this, I heard about the problems there before the break. It's showing you this nice diagram so that you can tell what properties we're talking about. So the ones we're seeing here on the screen are specific to relations. So when you select a relation in the BA diagram, there's going to be a row position property here, and it's got one property, source field. And the idea for the source field is it allows you to specify fields that will be used in the code to locate specific rows or specific selection set of data. So that's used for a couple of things, but one of the most common things that you'll use that for, that row position property, is for zoom forms. So when we talk about zoom forms, we'll be all about this row position field. All right, Laurent tells me that the bottom right of my slides aren't available. Rats. Okay, let me see if I can tinker. Anything right of relation on, oh, okay, there is nothing to the right of it. Good, good, good. Okay, so there's nothing to the right. And that's the way it looks for me too, because I think it's the selection I've made to display the slides is a kiosk view. So that way I can move around a bit better. But there is nothing to the right of it. Okay. So it sounds like you're able to see everything. That vertical bar there is on my screen too, and there's nothing that you're missing there. Filtering data. Now this is another important pair of properties that we'll see several times, I think, the next week or so. So you'll visit this and get very familiar with it and be comfortable with it. But this is what tells BAM what selection set that it needs to retrieve. It's a filter, basically. So it applies a SQL filter, like a where clause, basically, right? It creates a where clause underneath the cover to determine what gets selected and what the user sees in the form. So it has a source field where you specify a source field that you're using as the primary table, right? That would be the kind of the master table in this example. And in the destination field would be, for example, here I'm looking at accounts and I only want to see orders when this form is open that has order information in it that are for the account that I have selected in the account form. So that's what we're doing here. That sounds much more complicated than it really is. So when we get to an example of that, I'll demonstrate it for you, and I think it will be a lot easier. I just didn't do a great job of explaining that. But that's basically, if you're familiar with SQL, that's basically what it's using to configure a where clause for the select statement. So modeling and implementing a form with a list. So we just looked a few minutes ago at the steps to creating and looking at the properties for grid forms, And there's some overlap there between the properties for grid forms and list forms. So you've seen some things that are available for list forms too. But now we're going to look at the process, the wizard and whatnot, the options you pick to create a list form. So a list form is really just a CRUD form. You pick that option from the BA diagram to invoke the wizard, but it's the container that makes the difference. Instead of picking a grid container when you create a list form, you're going to pick a table container. The other thing that's important to remember about list forms, and we talked about this briefly yesterday too, is that list forms, remember, can only do certain things. They are not allowed to, or users that are using them are not allowed to add or modify for a list form. So you have to uncheck the add and modify functionality for a list form. We're going to talk about this two-column layout, how to customize what the form displays in the two columns that are available in a list form. If you remember, you can pick as many columns from the table as you like when you're going through the wizard, but for list forms it's only going to display the first two. So you have to be very selective about what you pick because only the first two columns that you pick can be displayed. Well, one of the things that you can do to better utilize that limited real estate is concatenate some of these fields that you want to be displayed together, and then in custom code display those concatenated fields to one of these two columns. And you can see in this example that that's what they've done here. So I've got some information here that probably comes from two different tables, or two different columns in a table. I've got this person's full name, Charles Smith or Fred Bloggs, whatever it happens to be, and there's a good chance that that's actually in two different columns of a table, like the last name and the first name, for example. But you can concatenate that information together and be able to display it in one of the allowed columns in the list form. And the same thing's maybe even more obvious here is the second column here that has, looks like the address information in it, is also concatenated information that looks like it came from at least two or three different columns from a database. So even though I only have two available areas, two different columns that I can specify to display in a form, I can use custom code to go in and concatenate fields together and able to use that real estate in a better way, more effectively, and show them more information. So that's what this is referring to here in step 3. Use two-column layout excuse me, by displaying concatenated information into form-only fields. So these fields are not actually last name, first name, or address fields. It's actually some form-only fields that we're just using to display concatenated information from table columns. Excuse me one second. Hopefully that's better. I had to clear my throat. There we go. Okay. Now step 4, we're also going to talk about in a later chapter. This is going to be in our custom code chapter where we talk about how to display an optional image with a row. This one doesn't display an image at all, but another thing you can do is configure one of your columns here, like this first one that shows what we consider the major field of information is the first one. You can configure that to display the value that's contained in another form-only field that holds an image value. And again, that sounds pretty complicated right now when I'm just talking about it, but when we get to the custom code chapter, we'll see some examples, we'll work with it, and I think that will make it a lot clearer. But just be aware right now that to customize a list form, sometimes that requires custom code to make it look like you really want it to look. If you want to display an image or have more information on the form than just two columns, then you have to do some custom coding. And then finally down here, number 5, is there's a good chance that you want the user to be able to specify an action that triggers another event in the application. Perhaps open another form from here that gives him additional information. So if the user selects a row or taps a row, typically that will trigger an action to move somewhere else in the application or display an additional form. So here is the wizard. This is the new form from Database Wizard, the same one that we used earlier in the chapter to configure a grid form. So here we're going along the same wizard again, but this time for the list form, we're going to select the table container instead of the grid container. And then remember, for list forms, they can only perform certain functions. So for list forms, we just need to go in right away before we try to implement the form and uncheck the add and modify functionality. And remember, you can do that in the actually you can do it in the relation, but for list forms, go ahead and do it in the record, right? The overall functionality. So do that in the record right away, and that way you won't have any issues when you try to implement the form. Because the list forms will never, no matter what the relation is, be able to do add or modify functionality. Now we talked about allowing the user to trigger an action by tapping on a row, selecting a row by tapping on it. To be able to do that, there's a special feature called double click that you can apply to a table container, which means your list form, right? Your list form uses a table container. So I can configure this double click feature as a property in my table in a list form, or I can configure it in custom code. Now the preferred method of configuring this double click option so that if a user taps on a row, it triggers an action, like an action to open a new form, for example. This feature is preferred in custom code. And the reason it's preferred or recommended to use custom code is because you have more control over it in the custom code than we do with just setting a property. But in your lab for this afternoon, I do have you creating a list form. Actually, it's your list form entity that you already have from yesterday's lab. And I'm going to have you use this double-click property just to get a feel for how it works. And then later, when we get to the custom code chapter, we'll get more familiar with the custom code method of configuring double-click because it has a lot more flexibility. You can do a lot more with it in the custom code. So that's double-click. A user can tap on a row, and that is basically selecting an option by selecting the row and tapping on it. So here we're talking about how the action is implemented. So when the user uses this double-click functionality and he taps on a row, in this example, it's going to trigger a view action, right? So it's going to open up a form, and that form's going to be in a certain mode, and it's going to be the display mode. So here it's just showing you that the special double-click feature is tied to a specific action. I grab my highlighter here. Where's my action? There it is. I've already got it highlighted. This view action. And notice here's something else we'll be talking a lot about. The open mode here, since I'm triggering a view relation, is display. So that's how we control the behavior of the form for a view action, is by setting the open mode to display. So the user will see information, but they won't be able to edit it or modify it directly. There might be an option available for them to use to add or modify information, but when they first see the form, it's only going to be displaying rows of data. It won't be allowing them to edit anything right off the bat. All right, and this topic is on working in Form Designer to enhance forms. It's not one of my strong suits, I think, is to enhance forms. My forms never are very pretty, but I can show you how to do it, and then hopefully you can make yours look a lot prettier than mine typically do. The good news for me and maybe you for mobile forms is that they're a lot simpler typically than forms that we use with desktop applications. There's a lot less information typically in the form. It's less cluttered so that there's not as much organization required to make the form look good. So it's really nice. List forms in particular require very little enhancement. They're pretty much what you see is what you go with whenever you create a list form. Now, grid forms, you can do some enhancement to a grid form if you like, but a lot of times even that enhancement is limited because there's just not that much going on with a mobile device form. They're small, remember they're small, only the most important information is displayed, so happily there's not as much work to do to make the forms look pretty or look good. So we can just go ahead and do it with this form here that we created earlier. I don't know whether to make this bigger or smaller so that you can see all the pieces and parts of the Genero mobile interface. But anyway, we have this form here that we have implemented earlier. So here's what the form looks like. Here's all of our columns that, well, it's not what the form looks like, but here's our record. It has all the columns in the form. Here's what our form looks like here in the Form tab. And right now, we ran it earlier, so let's take a look at it. When we look at it, it's not the most attractive looking form in the world, right? It's very simple, very straightforward, but it does work, so it is functional. So let me just show you a few things that you can do to maybe make the form look better. And I'm sure you would do a better job at this than I will, but at least you'll know how to go about it. So I'm going to get rid of this for a minute, now that we've had a look at it, and I'm going to try to make it look better for us. So one of the things that I can do with the form, there we go. So I want to be able to see our structures, structure view, and our properties for the form. And if you remember, I think we looked at this right after we created the form. We only had the one container, which was the grid container for the form. So one of the first things you'll want to do is create the layout for the form. And I'm going to specify, remember, the VBox layout. It's called VLayout here in the form structure view. So I'm going to pick that. And that gives us these brown areas at the top and the bottom with the redirectional arrows pointing up and down, telling us that it's a vertical layout versus a horizontal layout. So that makes it real quick to see visually what kind of layout you're using when you see that. So now if you look in the form structure view over here, it says we have our top level container is a VBox container, and then the grid is now nested inside of that VBox container. So our grid's in here. If I highlight the grid in the structure view, whoops, I did it again. There we go. If I highlight the grid in the structure view, you can see these little squares or rectangles here around the side so that you can see how big the grid form is. So if I want to really do anything with this form, one of the first things I'm going to have to do is give myself a little more real estate, a little more room in there to move around. So I'm going to do that by just grabbing the form, clicking on it, and then I can just drag it and make it bigger. Then I'm going to do the same thing here for my VBox. I'm going to drag it out too. Now I've got some room where I can move around. And notice too when I grab that VBox that it grabbed the grid container as well. So notice my grid now is larger. And now I can tinker with all of these form fields here inside my grid container and try to improve their appearance some. So the first thing I'm going to do is spread them out quite a bit and separate them out. So this is customer information that I'm tinkering with down here, and then this up here at the top is all job information. So I'm just going to move these around. And I may not get these perfectly lined up, but you can see that you can just by tinkering with them some. You can also use properties to align them. If you get to that point where it's got to be really, really perfect, you can get in there and use properties. I'm just doing these kind of rough and ready right now just to make it a little quicker for you. So now I've kind of rearranged them and spread them out some. The next thing I'll probably do is maybe group them, right, just to show you what a group looks like. Remember, we talked about a group container earlier on. Now up here in the toolbar, you've got all these different toolbar items for things you can do in Form Designer. Like here is creating a button and canvas and a lot of things we're not going to use typically for mobile forms, but we might. I'm going to look for the group container. Remember, a group is a type of container. Whoops, just want to click on that. There we go. And I'm going to make one group for all the job-related information. And notice when I do that, you see this rectangle and there's some text up there. And then over here, I'm going to select the group in the structure view and then go down and change the text property for it to be a little more meaningful than group 1. So I'm going to call it, how about job info? Works for me. Okay, so now there's job info group and all these fields inside there, job-related information. And maybe I'll go ahead and create another group for all the customer info. And in an ideal world, this would all be lined up, but all right, well, I've done a bad thing, and this is probably a good thing so that you can see it. Notice how I lost my labels here whenever I put that group in. That's a warning that I have overlapped some of the elements in my form, which is a bad thing. If I were to try to preview this form now, let me just try. Notice the preview option is grayed out. So that's another warning that I need to do something to fix this problem in my form. So the way I'm going to fix it is I'm going to get rid of that group that I just messed up. So now I'm back where I started before I messed up that group. So let's see if I can do it this time without messing it up. So I'm going to grab this group and try not to overlap anything. So I'm going to be very generous this time. That looks better. Right? See, notice my labels are still there. I haven't covered up anything by overlapping it, so it should be okay this time. And I'm going to go down and change my text to, say, customer info. See if it works this time. Now, thank goodness. Okay. So there, obviously it's still not pretty, but you can see some of the things you can do with groups and what effect it has with groups of information on the screen. There's still some things that probably need to be done, so let's take a look at a few things. For one thing, let's say maybe I want to add a button. Let me show you putting in a widget or so here. You can put a button in the form, and then of course you can associate an action with that button to trigger a new form to be opened. We'll learn more about that tomorrow too. Didn't want to get rid of that, but I guess I'm going to have to for you to be able to see and for me to be able to do it. There we go. Now I've got some more real estate now that I finally got rid of that. And I can create a button in here. Like a lot of times in the Pool Doctors app, you see these nice skinny buttons in there, sometimes separating information. What I could have done is moved all the information here in this customer info group down and put a button in between if I wanted to. But that'll be fine for now. You can see how to do a button. Now remember that later it's going to be important, and in your lab, to understand that the name of the button is what associates this button that the user is going to tap or select with the action of invoking a form, right, of using a relation to open a form. So this button is going to be associated with an action in the relation for a form, and that means that the names are going to have to be the same. So whatever I name this button is going to be the same name that the action uses when I configure the action. So I'm going to just call it call CusDetail. And that's going to have to be the name of an action eventually that I use to open a new form, for example, that maybe has the customer address or email info, something along those lines. But for the form display, I don't want the user to see the word button 1, so the text property is what's important for this part. So I'm just going to call it detail. There we go. So there's a button in the form. And again, it's still probably not the most attractive form in the world. It still needs a lot of work. Whoops, I didn't mean to hit compile. I meant to hit preview. Can you see that button way down at the bottom? There it is. There's a detail button down at the bottom, and I'd have to do a bit more configuration to have that actually trigger an action such as opening a new form that had perhaps additional customer information in it. But that's the starting point, right? It's creating the button and specifying that button name to be whatever the name of the action is going to be. Now it's still not real pretty. Right up here I've got Form 1, notice at the very top of the form. That's not a very nice name for this form. Also notice that I did not set all of my labels and widgets in my schema, which would have been a nice thing for me to have done, but I didn't. So now I'm going to have to do all this work here at the form level to change the labels and the widgets to what I want them to be. I'm not going to change them all, just in the interest of time, but just to show you that you can change them here in the form. And I consider this kind of a last resort because really all of these different labels, it's a lot easier to set them once in the schema than it is to come in here and have to do it for every form you create that uses that column. So here's how you do it though. You pick the label here in the form structure view, or you can pick it over here in the form itself, and then look in the properties. And in the properties you're going to look for that same text attribute that we used to change the name of the button on the form. So I'm going to call it job code. All right, and so that's how I changed the label for job code. And you can do that, of course, on all of them. I won't do all of them right now, but just enough to kind of get you started with that. The other thing we saw that wasn't very attractive was the form text at the top, the form title. So let's see if we can get that changed. So we're going to highlight the form itself. Same thing. Look for the text property, and I'm going to call it jobs. I'm not very creative with names either, but anyway, there we go. And let's see about the preview again. And now it says jobs instead of form 1 or whatever it said before. You can see we changed our job code label now. Looks better than it did before because previously it's just using the default column name, and now it's using a special label that I've used. So that's just the beginning of the many things that you can do with the form. Something else you can do, let me just change one more thing here. We've talked about some of these widgets, so let's change one of these form fields to a different widget. We've got a button widget already that you can see, but let's change this date created to a different widget. So we use this right click on it here, convert widget, and let's call it a date edit or a date time edit since it says date and time. So now that's what the date time edit widget looks like, and that allows the user then to pick a date like you would do normally in a mobile app. You can pick it from a calendar type widget versus having to type it in. So one more preview and then we'll call it good. It took longer than it should have because I messed up group 2. Okay, so here is my, what I'm going to call my finished form, even though you can see it needs some more work with the labels and maybe some additional widget changes and whatnot. I do see maybe one other thing I would probably do, and I'll show you that because we haven't done it yet. Notice I've got this JH customer field here, and I've got the customer name already down here, so I really don't see that the user needs to see this JH customer code. So if you remember, the way to keep that from displaying, it's in the record, and I'm okay with it being in the record. Maybe I'll use it for something later, but I don't want it in this form right now. So I can go in here and change that to, where'd it go here? JH customer, right? Change this guy to a Phantom. I remember the Phantom widget that we talked about. And notice it disappears from the form. It was right here. But I still have the label, so I'm just going to delete the label and get rid of it too. Label I'm just going to delete. There we go. So now I've cleaned that up, so now I'm only seeing the information on the form that I want to see. I didn't have to do anything to the record, so if there was, maybe that was a primary key value, let's pretend that it was for a minute, like job code. Well, I want to leave that job code field in my record because I need it for selection criteria, and I need it for the code, but I may not want the users to see it. So that's what that Phantom widget type is for. Okay, so there we go. We'll save it, even though it's not probably as pretty as a form you could make, and we'll move on. All right, so compiling and previewing forms. We just looked at the build preview options, so now you know all about that. Let me try to maximize this a little more. There we go. Oops. There we go. So you saw that just a minute ago, so we don't need to redo that. So this next section, that was a very short section. The next one is on form records. And I think we may have already discussed all of this, but let's just look at it just in case. Well, maybe we haven't. When you create your form record, this is saying that you can always modify that record later. Whatever form fields that you have added to the form, like with the wizard, for example, are also added to the record. So if you add a form to a field to the form, the field automatically gets added to the record. You can also directly edit the record itself and add fields to the record if you want to. You don't have to do that very commonly, but you certainly can do it. You can add a field if you want to, delete a field, whatever you need to do. You can also edit the query for the record. If you remember when you're going through the wizard and you've got that query that has the, for example, the join criteria, you can modify that later. If you add columns, for example, that are perhaps in a different table later on, then you'll also need to edit the query to add that, the join criteria for the where clause. I'll try at some point to give you an example of that or to show you an example of it, perhaps in a later chapter. Here's the record properties. We talked earlier about the importance of the functionality properties. Let me grab what I'm thinking there. The functionality properties right here. So here, remember, is the overall functionality for the form. So no matter what relation, you might have 3 different relations that use the same form or open the same form, but each relation can have different behavior. But initially, you're going to set all the possible behaviors for the form right here in these record properties. Can add, can modify, can delete, can search. So those are all your possible functions. So let's look at some of the other properties. Those I think are the most important, but there's others that are almost equally important, I guess. Here's the query that we just talked about being able to edit, and this is usually configured automatically by going through that create form wizard, right? The create CRUD form from database wizard. And then later, if we go in and add columns, fields to our record that perhaps come from a different table, maybe a detail table, then we would need to go in and edit this query and add these additional join conditions, right? So that the join works properly when the application runs. Active, way up here at the top, if it's not generating or not implementing a form, one of the things you can look for is to make sure that active check mark is checked. It has to be before it will implement the form or generate any code for the form. We talked about query. We've talked about the functionality. The only thing we haven't talked about here are these code links that you see here down at the bottom of the record properties. The happy news about code links is that when we do get to the custom code chapter, we're going to talk about code links and how you can use these code links like update, combo box, display attributes. You can select these code links and they will quickly take you to the correct place in the application code to be able to edit, use custom code to edit the behavior for selecting a row or doing an insert. So that's a fast way to find the right module, function, and place in the code to make a change that affects one of these functions, selecting, inserting, and that type of thing. So a very handy thing, and we'll talk a lot more about code links later on. API device forms and web component forms. We're on a downhill track here. So I know we're almost done with 2 hours of our time today, so the good news is we're almost finished. Creating an API device form. Remember earlier we said it's not really a form, it's just a way to kind of categorize it so we can talk about it easily. It's really just a relationship between a form and a mobile entity. And the form we're talking about here is not the form that's displaying this dial, you know, the area where we can make a phone call. It's talking about the parent form, right? So the parent form that this is being called from. So really an API device feature or API device functionality is really just all relationship and properties. We're not going to talk about implementing mobile entities yet. We're going to talk about them in the next module, so that'll be something we talk about tomorrow. And the same thing is true of web components, right? That was our 4th type of form. We're going through all 4 types here, but we're not really talking about these 2 in detail yet. So web components, we won't talk about them tomorrow. We'll be talking about web components next week. So that's a next week topic. There we go. So that was a long chapter and it had a lot of information in it. So before we look at the labs for today, or lab, singular, for today, does anybody have any questions or comments about the material? Okay, well, it looks like I haven't missed anything. I'm just going to check here real quick and make sure nobody has their hand up or anything of that nature. Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and close out of the PowerPoints for today and look at your lab. I'm going to open the lab over here and show it so you can see what you have in store. Now I know that some of you don't have a lab environment, a platform that you can use to work on the labs, so even if you're not planning on working on the labs or doing them, it might benefit you to walk through the lab, you know, just read through the lab at least, even if you can't actually do it, because it has an awful lot, I think, of good practice for configuring forms and properties here, which are about the most important thing to learning how to create a mobile application with BAM. It's got to be the forms and the properties because that's 90% of the whole thing. So here's our first exercise. We've created the job note list entity in yesterday's lab, so here we're going to implement the job note list form. The first exercise you're just preparing to by doing a little research. You're going to look at these screenshot mock-ups that I have here and try to figure out exactly what tables in your database and what columns in the database are being used for you to create a list form that looks like this. And then you're going to answer some questions about it. So that's what we're doing here. And then after you've done your research to figure out what tables and columns need to be used for that list form, exercise 2 actually has you go in and implement it and use that CRUD form from Database Wizard that we saw in the chapter. And so that's what these steps here are doing. They're walking through the wizard. And then here we're editing the form some, the form widgets. We're changing some of the widgets around, setting some phantom widgets, notice, just like we did in our demonstration today. And then since that's a list form, step 3, notice remove unsupported functionality from the form record. So remember, the list forms can only do certain things. They can't add or modify. So you have to remove the add and modify. And that's what it should look like when you're finished. And then here's where we're configuring the action to trigger the relationship that's going to display that new list form. So to configure the action to trigger the relationship, we actually have to go outside of our list form and go back to the form that is invoking the list form, right, where the customer is, or the user is actually able to select an action that will bring up our new list form. So that's what we're seeing here. We're looking at the job header grid entity.
Unmuted.
Lisa, I don't know if you're hearing this, but we've lost our audio now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, although I do believe some people have left the
Already?
training. Yeah, so
Okay.
it was near the end of time. I'll mute
Okay.
myself again, and if you want to continue walking through, that's fine.
All right, thanks. Okay, well, is everybody able to hear okay? Okay, Sylvia's, okay. Let me just see who's still here. Sorry about that. We lost audio for a few minutes, but we were almost finished anyway. We were just going through the lab. So let me finish quickly here before something dreadful happens again with the audio. So here we are. We're just configuring the action, and we'll review the lab tomorrow since we're having these difficulties. And then there's our new list form. And then down here, we're going to implement and configure the job note grid form. So we have steps for that. We do the same thing where we kind of prepare to do it by answering some questions and doing some research. Then we implement it, and then we're going to test it. So it's kind of a long lab, but I think that you can learn a lot from this lab just by walking through it, or actually, better yet, doing the lab, I think would help a lot. Exercise 5, finally down here at the bottom, is just tinker around with your form once you've got it created and see if you can enhance it a bit. You don't have to add any new containers like I did. On the other hand, you might want to just to get familiar with the process of adding a VBox or a group container and that type of thing. And then don't forget your build preview options, right? Your build preview options that you can use to see what it's going to look like without actually having to execute the code every time to do it. All right, so it's 16 pages long. It's kind of a long lab, but a lot of it is just informational. It's not a lot of work, I don't think.